This one's gonna be a bit different, folks. This one's gonna be a bit different. 2019's Joker was a movie that, in all fairness, didn't really need a sequel. It worked perfectly as a one-time standalone solo movie, providing a wildly different, brand new take on what is arguably the most iconic villain in all of media, in a way that's very reminiscent of older movies like Taxi Driver or The King of Comedy. And now, whether you believe that Joker was inspired by these movies or it ripped them off, that's an entirely different story. But whatever the case may be, it's definitely reminiscent of these movies in some way. And again, regardless of whether it was inspired by them or it was a ripoff of them, it doesn't matter because the final product ended up working. This is a Batman movie. There are Batman adjacent things in the movie's storyline, but it barely feels like a Batman movie, and that's part of what makes it so good. It has almost nothing to do with Batman or anything like that, but it just has small little details in it that make it closely related to Batman, and that ends up working in the movie's favor. Combine that with the absolutely phenomenal performance of Joaquin Phoenix as the titular Joker, or Arthur Fleck, providing his own unique spin on this character. His version of the Joker doesn't feel derivative of Jack Nicholson's version, or Heath Ledger's version, or God forbid Jared Leto's version. No, it feels like Joaquin Phoenix's version of the Joker. A fresh, unique take on this iconic, beloved character. Whether you love this movie or not, you cannot deny it is iconic. The scene where Arthur Fleck as the Joker is dancing down the stairs, you get what you deserve. Whether you like the movie or not, you cannot deny these are iconic scenes. Some of the most iconic scenes in any modern movie ever. And even though the movie works as a kind of origin story for the character of the Joker, it works as a standalone movie. There's no reason for it to get a sequel. The movie is meant to showcase a mentally ill man who is struggling in society until eventually he snaps and becomes the Joker. And this is around the same time where the city that he's living in is becoming worse and worse to live in. Protesters and rioters everywhere criticizing the current state of Gotham. And then by the end of the movie, these people look up to Arthur Fleck. They look up to the Joker as this sort of spokesperson for this movement. The movie does end with Arthur Fleck in Arkham, but it leaves you wondering, what is he gonna do now? That ambiguous feel to the ending is perfect because it's left to your imagination. What will happen with Arthur Fleck? What will happen with the Joker going forward? It works perfectly. We didn't need a sequel to Joker, and yet we got one anyways. A lot of people were skeptical at first with the idea of a Joker sequel, believing that, again, the first movie worked perfectly on its own. It didn't need a second movie. It didn't need a sequel. It worked perfectly as a one-time standalone movie with an ambiguous ending. And then it was later announced that the movie would be a musical, which further turned people away. Despite all of that, though, the trailers for Joker 2, no, I cannot be bothered to pronounce the movie's subtitle. I know it's a French phrase, I know it means a madness shared by two or whatever, but I cannot be bothered to pronounce it, I'm sorry. I'm just referring to this as Joker 2 for the entire video. When the trailers for this movie came out, it did make the movie look good. You have Joaquin Phoenix back as Arthur Fleck, but joining the cast, you have Lady Gaga as Harley Quinn, which is, that's definitely a casting decision, I'm not gonna lie. Who knows, maybe it could have worked, maybe it won't work. We have no way of knowing until the movie comes out. The initial skepticism that people had about the movie, the whole idea that it was a musical, the idea of whether it needed to exist or not, what could you tell about this character that wasn't already told in the first movie? That kind of went away with the trailers because they made the movie look really good. Whenever I saw a movie in theaters and the trailer for this movie would play beforehand, I'm over here thinking, oh wow, I can't wait to see this. This is going to be a great movie. This is going to be one of those standout movies of 2024. And as I've established numerous times before in previous videos, 2024 has been a awful year for movies. Easily one of the worst years in movie history. Good God. I was over here hoping that Joker 2 could be one of the standout movies. One of the few great movies to come out of 2024. And then the movie came out and I watched it. I saw that prior to the movie properly coming out in theaters, the reviews for it were negative, but I wanted to give this a fair chance. I figured this could be a situation where it's like critics don't like it, but audiences love it, because that's kind of how it was with the first movie. It got mixed reviews from critics, but audiences loved it. So maybe it's the same thing with this movie, right? Right? And then I watched the movie. What a f***ing disappointment. Honestly, Joker 2 is not the worst movie of the year. It doesn't come close to being the worst movie of the year. Stuff like Madam Web, Borderlands, whatever, they are far worse movies than this. But it is easily the most disappointing movie of 2024. In a way, I think this movie is worse than Madam Web and Borderlands, in the sense that, like, no one expected those movies to be good. I sure as hell did not expect those movies to be good. I willingly went to see both of these movies because I saw how awful the reviews for them were. The moment I saw Borderlands debut with a 0% on Rotten Tomatoes, I knew I was in for a disaster. And indeed, I got a disaster. I did not expect either of these movies to be good. I expected this movie to be good, though. Again, the trailers made this movie look amazing. I thought this was going to be a great movie. I thought that director Todd Phillips would prove all of us wrong. Yeah, a Joker sequel could work. A Joker sequel could be great. So in a technical way, this movie is worse than Madam Web or Borderlands in that aspect. And the movie is not badly made either. This isn't some poorly made piece of crap either. This is a very competently made movie. There are a lot of things about this movie that give it that potential that, yeah, this could actually be a great movie. This is not a poorly made piece of trash. This is a competently made piece of trash, which, again, that's arguably worse. Let's get some of the positives out of the way, because I feel like being generous. Joaquin Phoenix is great in this movie, much like with the first movie. The thing is, though, and this is a bit of a spoiler, this is a very spoiler-heavy review. I should have brought that up in advance, but I'm bringing it up now. This is a very spoiler-heavy review. You don't really see him as the Joker much in this movie. This movie introduces the idea that, like, Arthur Fleck and the Joker are two separate people. The Joker is an alter ego for Arthur Fleck, something along those lines. You don't really see the Joker much in this movie, but you do see a lot of Arthur Fleck. As I brought up before, the first movie was all about how Arthur Fleck slowly but surely transitioned into the Joker. And that's kind of what audience wanted to see. They wanted to see more of the Joker. You don't make a movie that's all about how Arthur Fleck became the Joker and then have the sequel just be about Arthur Fleck only, barely giving us the Joker. But this is all stuff that I will address much later on into the video. And then similarly, Lady Gaga is good as Harley Quinn, but she is barely in the movie. She's only in the movie for like 25 or so minutes. This movie is around 2 hours long, and she's only in the movie for like 25 to 30 minutes. And she barely does anything in the movie. Her character does almost nothing. If you watch the trailers for this movie and you went to see it expecting a Bonnie and Clyde-esque story involving the Joker and Harley Quinn committing crimes, you will be highly disappointed, because there is nothing like that in this movie. As I mentioned before, this movie is a musical. Now, I could be wrong on this, but I believe the news that, like, this movie is a musical came out before any of the trailers for the movie were released. Before we saw anything of this movie, we knew that it was a musical, but none of the movie's trailers emphasized that, yeah, this is a musical. So if you went into this movie not knowing that it was a musical, you went into it because you thought it looked good and because you love the first movie, you're gonna look at all the musical scenes, you're gonna be like, what the f*** is going on? That gritty 1970s feel that the first movie had is almost completely gone in this movie. Again, I understand the first movie was either inspired by or it ripped off Taxi Driver and The King of Comedy, but still, that gritty 70s feel that the first movie had, it fits perfectly into it. It's perfectly executed, and it's almost completely gone in this movie. Oh yeah, by the way, this is a jukebox musical, meaning all of the songs in this movie, they're covers. They're not original songs written for the movie, for better or worse. They're all covers of existing songs. Now, the songs themselves are like, if you take them out of the context of like the rest of the movie, they're okay. There's nothing wrong with them. They're not poorly composed or anything like that. Without being disrespectful, I will say that Joaquin Phoenix cannot sing, but I have no idea if that was done intentionally. When you listen to him singing in this movie, you have to wonder, like, was it intentionally done to be bad, or does he actually like sing like that? Considering the way that this movie is, there is a very real possibility that, yeah, they made him sing badly on purpose, but who knows really. If he's not good at singing, then, well, it happens. Great at acting, not very good at singing. It happens. The problem with the songs, though, is that they don't really have much to do with the actual movie. There's like a lot of different songs in this movie, and only like a few of them are actually important to the movie's storyline. Most of the musical numbers are like fantasy sequences that you could cut them out of the movie and you would miss nothing important from them. You know, all of those really interesting looking moments from the trailers, yeah, not only are they musical numbers, but they're also fantasy sequences. They don't actually happen in the movie. You know that scene in the trailer where you have like the Joker and Harley Quinn show or whatever, and you're watching and you're thinking, oh wow, what are they gonna do with that in the final movie? Yeah, guess what? They do nothing with it. You know why? Because it's a fantasy sequence. It doesn't actually happen in the movie. It has little to no importance to the actual movie's storyline. This potentially interesting scene from the movie's trailer, yeah, you could cut it out of the final movie and it would have no impact on the movie's plot. The movie would still be exactly the same with or without this scene. It's filler, basically. That's what a lot of the musical numbers feel like. They feel like filler. Like they're desperately trying to pad out the movie's runtime to have it be 2 hours long. Now, something that I will praise a few of the musical numbers for, a few of the fantasy sequences for, a lot of the set designs are really good. Even though I'm disappointed that it's a fantasy sequence, I do love the 1970s variety show aesthetic that the Joker and Harley Quinn show has. I'll admit that a few of the songs, like very few of the songs, they're kind of catchy, but that doesn't really mean much because, again, this is a jukebox musical. These are not original songs that were written for the movie. These are covers of already existing songs. None of these positive qualities change the fact that it was a bizarre decision to make this movie a musical. The people that love the first Joker are not exactly the kind of people that love musicals. All of the musical numbers just feel like you're watching a parody of the first movie. Like you're watching something made to make fun of the first movie, which that could very well easily be the case, and I'll explain what I mean by that later on into the video. I'm willing to bet they made this a musical just because they got Lady Gaga in the movie. It's like, hey, we got this famous pop star in our movie, and you know what? A few years ago, she was in this massively successful musical movie. So you know what? It. Let's make Joker 2 a musical. Why the hell not? That's totally not going to clash with the gritty tone of the first movie. No siree. Even if this movie didn't have musical numbers in it, it would still not be a very good movie. Nothing really happens in this movie, kind of. Again, all of the interesting looking moments from the trailers, they're just fantasy sequences. They don't actually happen, so, you know, that's one thing. But there's also of the fact that in addition to being a musical, this movie is also a courtroom drama. This movie only takes place in 2 locations, Arkham Asylum and a courthouse, and that's it. You never get to see the gritty streets of Gotham City like in the first movie. At the end of the first movie, you had a bunch of people that were supporting Arthur Fleck, that were supporting the Joker, believing him to be this sort of hero for their movement. At the end of the first movie, there were all kinds of riots going on, people destroying things, lighting things up on fire, and it's like, there's nothing like that in this movie. I understand there is a 2-year time skip between the first movie and this movie, but still, it's like none of this stuff ever happened. Like, it was retconned out of existence. You know how Thomas Wayne was an important character in the first movie? Yeah, I don't even think they say his name even once in the second movie. The whole idea about like how the people of Gotham were tired of how they were being treated when compared to the elite rich people like Thomas Wayne, that's not explored in this movie. It's like it never happened. It's not acknowledged, it's not brought up, it's nothing. So to make a long story short, half of the movie is a musical and the other half is a courtroom drama. Again, if you went into this expecting a Bonnie and Clyde-esque movie with Joker and Harley Quinn, you're gonna be disappointed. At no point in the movie does it ever feel like things are building up to something interesting. Like it's all gonna culminate with something big and crazy happening. Like how the first movie, it culminates with Joker shooting Murray Franklin. There's nothing like that in this movie. I'm not asking for them to repeat the Murray Franklin scene, but it wouldn't hurt to have something interesting. It wouldn't hurt to have a climax of some sorts. This movie ends almost exactly the same way it starts. It feels like nothing really changes, nothing really advances forward. And now I have nothing against the idea of like a courtroom drama, but like this movie doesn't really do it all that well. So like most of the courtroom drama scenes are just them reciting what happened in the first movie. Arthur Fleck murders Murray Franklin. He murders those 3 guys on the subway, that sort of thing. Just recapping everything you already saw in the first movie. I rewatched the first movie the night before I watched this movie, and so it's like it felt redundant. I guess if for whatever reason you decided not to rewatch the first movie before watching this movie, I guess, you know, you can get a refresher. I have no idea. But half of the movie is just, hey, remember this thing that happened in the first movie? Yeah, it happened. And then the other half is the musical numbers. And it just goes back and forth between the two. And it's honestly kind of boring, really. It has the potential to be interesting, but all of the potentially interesting moments, they're musical numbers and fantasy sequences. The fact that a big plot point from the first movie is just seemingly never acknowledged in this second movie makes it even worse. A character that was important to the first movie is never acknowledged once in this second movie. The general structure of this movie is just really weird. It's like normally a lot of movies have a first act, a second act, and a third act, but then this movie is just one giant first act. I could not pinpoint to you the exact moment the first act ends and the second act begins because there is no second act. The movie is just a 2-hour-long first act. It doesn't feel like anything advances forward in the plot. It's just a really weird structure, really weird pacing that I don't think I've ever seen in any other movie. And maybe in any other context I would be like, wow, that shows how bold and experimental this movie is, but all it does is just leave me confused. Why? This movie has a shockingly high budget of $200 million, and god damn it, it does not feel like a $200 million movie. I have no idea where this money went when making this movie. I mean, obviously, yeah, they have to pay Joaquin Phoenix to come back. Lady Gaga for sure costed quite a bit of money. There's no way she was cheap. Maybe the set designs could have costed money, you know, getting the licenses for the songs, I don't know, but that's not really enough. The first movie, for comparison, had a budget of, I believe, $70 million, and it feels like more stuff happens in the first movie when compared to the second movie, and it doesn't feel like a $200 million movie either, but it feels more like one than the second movie does. Apparently, this movie had a lower domestic opening than Morbius. I am not kidding you. The really bad word of mouth that the movie received prior to properly coming out. I believe they showed this movie first in like Venice, I believe, and that's where the early negative reviews from critics came from. This movie didn't receive a test screening for some reason. Maybe it's because they knew this movie would be largely hated. I have no idea. But over the last couple of days, I've seen nothing but people trashing this movie, calling it a terrible sequel, and that is for sure affecting its box office. Let me remind y'all that the first movie had a $70 million budget, and it made $1 billion with a capital B at the box office. It was the highest grossing R-rated movie until Deadpool and Wolverine came out this year, and it still stands as one of the highest grossing movies of 2019. And on a somewhat unrelated note, looking at this top 10 list makes me realize, damn, Disney really did dominate the world in 2019. What a complete 180 when you look at how things are for Disney in 2024. This movie, in contrast, is definitely not going to make back its budget. It would have to make around like $450 to $500 million, and there's almost no chance of that happening. By the time this video is uploaded, it will be around a week since this movie was released in theaters. I went to see this movie opening night, and my theater was pretty packed. There were a good amount of people in it. While working on this video, seeing how it was about a week since the movie was released, I decided to check my local theater. I decided to check the screenings for the movie, and I saw that a lot of the seats were completely empty. Maybe there were like 4 to 5 people sitting in them, but that was it. It was an absolutely insane sight to see, considering how wildly successful the first movie was. This movie for sure is going to end up being one of the biggest box office flops of 2024, potentially one of the biggest box office flops of all time. It's almost incredible looking at how they could go from having a $1 billion movie to having a box office flop. A movie with a lower domestic box office than Morbius. As I mentioned before, this was in part because of the musical numbers, but there are other reasons pertaining to the storyline, so let's go over those, shall we? As I mentioned before, this movie introduces the idea that Arthur Fleck and the Joker are not the same thing, which on paper could be an interesting idea. There could be a lot of different ways this idea could be interestingly executed. Unfortunately, it doesn't end up working because, again, for most of the movie, you see Arthur Fleck. You don't see the Joker at all. And so it just kind of makes this whole thing more underwhelming. If you had equal parts the Joker and Arthur Fleck throughout the movie, then this would be fine. But most of the movie is just Arthur Fleck. Again, you don't make a movie about how Arthur Fleck became the Joker and then have the sequel just be entirely Arthur Fleck, with the Joker very rarely appearing in the movie. Most of the time when you see the Joker in this movie, it's in a fantasy sequence musical number. I think there's only like one scene. There's one trial scene where you see like the Joker in the real world, and then in the rest of his appearances, they're in like a fantasy sequence. And so that ends up making this idea underwhelming. In the latter half of the movie, there's a scene where a bunch of prison guards assault Arthur Fleck. There's a different word that I could use for this, but I don't want to say it because I don't want to risk getting demonetized. It's not shown in the movie, but it is heavily implied, and I guess this is what convinces Arthur to just admit that the Joker doesn't exist. In the following trial, Arthur admits there is no Joker. It was Arthur Fleck and not the Joker that shot Murray Franklin. It was Arthur Fleck and not the Joker that murdered those 3 guys on the subway in the first movie. Most of the movie just portrays Arthur as this sad, pathetic loser. I've seen a lot of people speculate that this was done in response to the incel "we live in a society we weirdos that loved the first movie for the wrong reasons, that looked up to Arthur Fleck for the wrong reasons. The problem is, with how the movie executes this idea, it ends up insulting anyone that loved the first movie, even like normal people that acknowledged Arthur Fleck was not a good person. Shortly after that, Arthur meets up with Harley Quinn in the iconic Joker stares from the first movie, and Harley ends up leaving Arthur because she doesn't care about Arthur Fleck. She wanted to be with the Joker, and now that Arthur had essentially retired the Joker and admitted that he regrets it, kind of, she doesn't want to be with Arthur anymore, which again could be an interesting idea, except for the fact that, again, Lady Gaga barely appears in the movie. She barely does anything. Her character barely does anything in the entire movie. You barely see these two interact with each other in the movie, and most of their interactions are, again, in the in musical sequences, the fantasy sequences, whatever. Most of the musical numbers are in these fantasy sequences, and those are like the only times where it's like you see the Joker in the movie and not Arthur Fleck. Those are the only times where you see Arthur Fleck or the Joker or whatever interacting with Harley Quinn. They barely do anything together in the real world. And so once again, this potentially interesting idea ends up feeling very underwhelming. Now, with the exception of Arthur getting assaulted by the security guards, seriously, there is no way to justify or fix that scene. The only way you could fix that scene is if you removed it from the movie. But besides that, the other ideas I've brought up, they have the potential to work. The idea that, like, Arthur Fleck and the Joker are not the same person. The idea that, like, Arthur Fleck regrets the Joker and he acknowledges that, like, there was never a Joker. It was him that did all the terrible things. The response to the incel "we live in a society" fans of the first movie that looked up to Arthur Fleck as this hero, even though he was not supposed to be someone to look up to. The idea that Harley Quinn wanted to be with the Joker and not Arthur Fleck, and that's why she left Arthur, all of that could be potentially interesting. Here is the problem. Barely anything happens in this movie, and so it ends up coming off as just underwhelming, a lot of these ideas. If there was stuff that happened in this movie, these ideas could be a lot better. You could very easily have a Bonnie and Clyde-esque story with the Joker and Harley Quinn, and also have that tie into the whole idea that, like, Arthur Fleck eventually ends up regretting the Joker stuff. He ends up regretting what he started, and that's what causes him to admit there was no Joker. It was Arthur Fleck that did everything. And then that also ties into the idea that, like, Harley Quinn doesn't want to be with Arthur Fleck, she wants to be with the Joker. You can have that and also give the fans what they wanted, a Bonnie and Clyde-esque crime story with the Joker and Harley Quinn. You can have both in the movie. It's possible, I promise y'all. You know how at the end of the first movie, you had all these people that looked up to Arthur as this hero of some sort? You had all these rioters and protesters that looked up to him as a hero? Yeah, that's barely explored in this second movie. And I feel like if this was a bigger part of the second movie, this could have had the whole thing of, like, we don't want to be associated with the incel fans of the first movie. That whole thing could have worked a lot better. You could have Arthur Fleck see the cult following that he has garnered, and that ends up causing him to regret what he started with the Joker. It would also make it a lot easier for the movie to acknowledge that, yes, we're specifically targeting the incel fans of the first movie. Those that are normal and liked the first movie and acknowledge that Arthur Fleck was not a hero of any kind, they're not being targeted by this. It's the incel "we live in a society" people that we're making fun of here. A lot of the ideas that are in this movie, they can stay, but it would also be helped if stuff actually happened in this movie, instead of just having it go back and forth between a fantasy sequence musical number and a courtroom scene. With how the final movie turned out, it doesn't feel like an insult to the incel "we live in a society" fans of the first movie. It feels like an insult to anyone that liked the first movie. It's honestly kind of ironic that this movie is so ashamed of the first movie, and yet half of the movie is just them recapping the stuff that happened in the first movie, without adding anything new to the table. They add nothing new to the whole thing of like, the Joker shot Murray Franklin, the Joker murdered the 3 guys on the subway. They add nothing new to that. It's just repeating what happened in the first movie without adding anything new to it. And as I brought up before, there is important stuff from the first movie, seemingly important stuff that's just never acknowledged once in this sequel. There's an entire character that was important to the first movie that they don't even say his name even once in this second movie. The rioters and protesters from the first movie, they don't get acknowledged at all. The closest this movie gets to showcasing the devoted fan base Arthur Fleck and the Joker and whatever garnered at the end of the first movie, the closest the movie gets to calling out the incel fans of the first movie is in the final trial scene, where the jury is finding Arthur guilty for everything that he did in the first movie. And then while this is happening, an explosion is set off behind Arthur. And I just want to say, I can't show it for obvious reasons, but the explosion looks absolutely terrible. I don't know if it's like the explosion itself or it's like the way the camera shakes, if that makes sense. It's really hard to tell you this without showing you what it looks like visually, but something about it looks really off. And remember, this movie had a $200 million budget, so it makes even less sense as to why it looks bad. But anyways, an explosion is set off, and then these 2 people, they kidnap Arthur, I guess, and like they drive away. They're trying to drive away out of Gotham City with Arthur, I guess, to just like, start a new life in a city. I have no idea. And then while this is happening, Arthur gets up and leaves the car. And then that's it. That's the only time you ever really see, like, the devoted fan base that Arthur had garnered in the first movie. That's the closest the movie gets to criticizing the incel fans of the first movie. Besides that, the movie just feels ashamed of the first movie. Like, it's trying its hardest to disassociate itself from the first movie, which, again, is really hard for it to do, because most of the movie is just them reciting what happened in the first movie. There's one scene in the movie where they actually add on to something that happened in the first movie. There's one actually good scene in this movie, one of the courtroom trial scenes that I thought was actually pretty good. In the first movie, shortly before Arthur leaves to the Murray Franklin show, he's visited by 2 former co-workers, Randall and Gary. Early into the first movie, Randall gives Arthur a gun, and then while Arthur is performing at a children's hospital, the gun accidentally slides out, and this causes him to be fired from his job, and further escalates his descent into becoming the Joker. As a result of this, Arthur ends up murdering Randall. However, he decides to let Gary go unharmed. And so in this movie, there's a scene where Gary is brought up as one of the witnesses in court. And for once, the movie actually adds new information into what happened in the first movie. Gary revealed that ever since that incident, he's been scared for his life. He's had numerous sleepless nights, worried that Arthur will find him and murder him. And it's actually a pretty powerful scene. It's like the only good scene in the entire movie. And it shows that you can acknowledge what happened in the first movie and actually add like new information to it instead of just recapping what happened in the first movie for no other reason other than just because. But no, remember, we're ashamed of the first movie. We want to distance ourselves away from the first movie because of a minority of people that liked it for the wrong reasons, in which the criticism towards that minority of people was very poorly executed, and so it instead comes off like the movie is criticizing anyone that liked the first movie. The biggest kicker to all of this, though, is the ending. Probably one of the most controversial movie endings in recent history. And even though it's extremely early for me to say this, I think this could go down as one of the most controversial endings in movie history. Joker 1's ending was iconic for the right reasons. Joker 2's ending is iconic for the wrong reasons. Occasionally throughout this movie, there is this inmate who doesn't really have much importance to the movie, but they do show him from time to time to make you think that, like, yeah, this is gonna build up to something. He's gonna be important at some point. And so near the end of this movie, as Arthur is walking somewhere, this guy goes up to Arthur and tells him a joke. And the joke ends up culminating with him stabbing Arthur to death. And as the camera zooms into Arthur Fleck dying, you could see in the background this guy cutting his mouth with the knife, implying that he becomes Heath Ledger's Joker. Which honestly kind of makes both of these movies pointless now in retrospect. It just opens up a lot more questions, and it's never going to answer any of them. Does this mean that Joaquin Phoenix's Joker is not actually the real Joker, and instead he was just the guy who inspired the real Joker? Or does this mean that Heath Ledger's Joker is not the real Joker, and instead he's just some guy who was inspired by Joaquin Phoenix's Joker? Like, it makes no sense. It really makes no sense at all. I'm guessing the movie is trying to convey that, like, anyone could be the Joker. There doesn't have to be one Joker, but, like, I don't know, it's like, it's so poorly done and confusing. Oh yeah, I figured this might be relevant to bring up. Apparently the first Joker was gonna end with Joaquin Phoenix's version of the character carving a smile into his mouth just like Heath Ledger's version, but then Christopher Nolan, who was with Warner Bros. At the time, rejected the idea, believing that Heath Ledger's version was the only version allowed to do that. And so now that Christopher Nolan is no longer at Warner Bros, the people behind this movie decided, okay, we could put it into this movie now. He's not going to do anything about it. He can't do anything about it. So, you know, that just to make things even better. At the same time, I can ever so slightly see where they're coming from with this whole idea that, like, Arthur Fleck, Joaquin Phoenix, whatever, is not the real Joker. In the first movie, we see Bruce Wayne, who we all know as Batman, but it has him as a kid. And so, in this universe, this would mean that, like, when Bruce Wayne grows up and becomes Batman, that would make Arthur Fleck basically like a really old man, an elderly man. And so it doesn't really line up perfectly. And so then you have this younger guy becoming the real Joker, Heath Ledger's Joker, potentially. And so I guess it kind of lines up more with the timeline in a way. I don't know. Even then, I'm pretty sure this other guy would still be too old to be like the actual Joker by the time Bruce Wayne becomes Batman. Remember, there's only a 2-year time skip between the first movie and the second movie. This would also make Lady Gaga's Harley Quinn too old to fight the Batman in this universe, and it's never implied that, like, there's someone else who becomes the next Harley Quinn after Lady Gaga, and so it opens up more questions and answers, and it's so confusing, seriously. Maybe I'm overthinking this stuff, but I have no idea. Part of what made the first Joker so good was that it was its own thing. It was its own take on this character. It wasn't attached to any universe. It wasn't attached to the then ongoing DCEU. It wasn't part of the Dark Knight universe. It wasn't part of the Michael Keaton, Tim Burton Batman universe. Years later, it would be announced that this movie doesn't take place in the same universe as the Robert Pattinson Batman universe. It's its own thing. It's not connected to any cinematic universe. It's not connected to anything like that. It's its own standalone thing. And so when you have an ending like this, vaguely implying that you're tying it to another Batman universe, it just opens up more questions and it answers none of them. And then it just really makes you question, why did they make this movie in the first place? The first movie worked perfectly as a one-time standalone film, and that's it. This movie not only undoes everything that was established in the first movie, but it also just makes the timeline so much more confusing. Why did they make this movie, honestly? Why did they make it? Well, actually, I know the reason why. There's one reason that they made this movie, and one reason only. The first Joker was originally announced to be a standalone one-time movie, and that was it. But then something happened that made them change their minds. Wink, wink. Director Todd Phillips has announced that he doesn't plan to make a third Joker movie. He doesn't plan to make a spin-off movie focusing on Lady Gaga's Harley Quinn. His time with DC was just these two movies, and that's it. It's going to leave all of these questions completely unanswered, but at least that means the first movie won't be further ruined. It's one thing to have a great movie with a bad sequel, but when you have a trilogy that has one great movie and two bad sequels, it's a whole nother story. I mean, just look at the other big movie that Todd Phillips is known for, The Hangover. The first movie in 2009 was largely successful, but then the sequels from 2011 and 2013 were a lot more poorly received in comparison. Between Hangover 2 and 3 and Joker 2, I think it's safe to say that Todd Phillips isn't exactly the best when it comes to making sequels. And yes, it might seem very hard to believe, but it is indeed true. The Hangover and Joker were both made by the same person. Quite the filmography Todd Phillips has, I must say. Quite the filmography. I don't know who the target audience is supposed to be for this movie. If you loved the first Joker, you're going to hate this movie. If you hated the first Joker, then why the hell would you watch its sequel outside of morbid curiosity, maybe? But even then, there's a chance that you're gonna hate this movie as well, regardless. To be fair, I could kind of see someone that hated the first movie liking this movie, simply because this movie undoes everything that was established in the first movie. But I've yet to come across someone that genuinely believes that. I've seen nothing but unanimous hate for this movie from people that both love and hate the first movie. As I've mentioned numerous times before, this movie is a musical for some ungodly reason. I don't know about the rest of y'all, but I don't think there's much of an overlap between fans of the first Joker and fans of musicals. Those that loved the gritty, dark nature of the first movie are going to be turned away by the fact that it's not in this movie. They're going to be turned away by all of the musical sequences in this movie. And those that love musicals are likely going to be turned away by the gritty, dark tone of the first movie, even if the second movie doesn't have that gritty, dark tone and is a musical. Lady Gaga is barely in the movie, and she barely does anything, so it's not like fans of her could go and support this movie. This is a movie made for no one. I've gone on about fan service before in movies. This is a movie that's like, it has no fan service at all. It does everything in its power to just disrespect the fans of the first Joker. This movie was supposed to criticize a minority of fans of the first movie, and instead it criticizes anyone that liked the first movie. Todd Phillips and Warner Bros. Both should have seen this coming, but naturally when you make something that's just a big giant you to the fans, they are gonna respond, the fans. This movie is doing terrible at the box office, as was previously established. This is another movie where its box office performance is so bad that it's coming out on digital not even a full month after the movie was released. This movie came out October 4th, and it's coming to digital October 29th. Not even a full month, and already it's coming to digital. With how unnecessarily high the budget for this movie was, it was expected to make like $1 billion or so in order to be successful, on account of the fact that, again, people loved the first Joker. The first Joker made $1 billion at the box office. Even though people were skeptical about whether we needed a Joker sequel, the trailers convinced people that, yeah, this actually looked really good. This could have been a good movie. And then the early reviews for the movie came out, and they were all terrible. This movie really shows you the power that word of mouth can have for something. When I went to see the movie opening night, it was pretty packed, packed, but I guess that is to be expected for opening night. I checked my local theater for the movie's second week, and it's like most of the theaters showing it, most of the screenings are almost completely empty. Most of the people that were gonna go and see this movie, they've either sailed the seven seas for it, or they refuse to watch it because of what they heard about this movie. Any and all hype that this movie had at some point, it just completely went away when the word of mouth started to spread. This is an extremely rare instance where critics and audiences put aside their differences to just hate something together, to acknowledge that a movie is bad. This isn't like the first movie where critics had a mixed opinion on it. It was a very polarizing movie for critics. They either loved it or hated it, but it was generally loved by the audiences. No, this is a movie that both people hate it, both sides hate it. Critics hate it and audiences hate it. You go onto Rotten Tomatoes right now, this movie has like a 33% critic score and a 31% audience score. And I swear at some point they were both 32%. The audience and critic scores, they were the same percentage, which I have never seen that before with another movie. And then you look at the movie's grade on CinemaScore. Now, for those who don't know what CinemaScore is, I believe it's this program, website, something. It's dedicated to audience feedback. It's similar to Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic, except it grades movies based on audience feedback. So it's purely from audiences and not from critics, to my knowledge. CinemaScore has an A+ to F grading, with A+, of course, meaning, oh, this is the best movie ever made, it's a masterpiece, whatever, and then F meaning, this is garbage, it's horrible, it's irredeemable. You want to know what score this movie got? A D. I'm not kidding, this movie got a D. Out of every comic book movie out there, this movie has the lowest score on CinemaScore. I saw people say that like this movie got a lower grade on CinemaScore than Fantastic from 2015. It has a lower score than Madam Web and Morbius, which is absolutely incredible to think. Imagine going back in time to the beginning of this year and telling people that Joker 2 will be worse than f***ing Madam Web. Nobody is going to believe you. Nobody at all. Granted, quality-wise, this movie is nowhere near as bad as Madam Web. Madam Web is a worse movie in a way, but again, as I mentioned before, no one thought Madam Web was going to be a good movie, whereas this is a movie that people wanted to be good, and so it ends up being a very big difference. Not to mention the fact that Madam Web is at least a tiny bit funny bad. When I first watched it, I didn't really look at it as much of a funny bad movie, but maybe upon a rewatch I'll laugh at it and think, yeah, this is hilariously garbage. That's not going to happen with Joker 2. There is nothing funny bad about Joker 2. The existence of this movie is the only joke associated with it. So yes, when you make a movie that insults fans of the previous movie, people will retaliate by not watching your movie, and those that do watch it, a majority of which I want to imagine sail the seven seas for it because of the negative word of mouth, they are going to add more negativity to the movie's reputation. This whole thing reminds me of another movie that I've previously talked about. It's like the polar opposite of this other movie. It makes me think of Deadpool and Wolverine. Now, I'm gonna admit something. I didn't like Deadpool and Wolverine all that much, and now before the man-children Redditors get their panties in a twist over this because I don't love their wholesome Chungus movie, allow me to explain. I don't think Deadpool and Wolverine is a bad movie necessarily, but it is heavily flawed. It is too flawed for me to say that, like, it's a great movie, or even a good movie, even decent. There are good things in Deadpool and Wolverine, but there are also enough flaws in the movie for it to drag down whatever enjoyment I could have had watching the movie. I made a few videos a while back going over Deadpool and Wolverine and why I didn't like it. Those videos were poorly received, but I still stand by some of the stuff I said in those videos. Admittedly, I might have been overreacting when I said that like the positive reception and commercial success of this movie could ruin the reputation of superhero movies, but I still stand by my claims that like the constant meta ironic jokes about how the multiverse stuff in the MCU sucks, they're not funny if the MCU continues to do the multiverse crap and it continues to suck. I still stand by my claim that the movie heavily relies on its fan service, and if you took the fan service out of Deadpool and Wolverine, it wouldn't exist. There would be no Deadpool and Wolverine. And that's what I want to talk about, the difference between both of these movies. It's almost incredible looking at how polar opposite these two movies are when it comes to fan service. You have a movie that gives the fans exactly what they want, maybe a little bit too much of what they want, and then you have a movie that just gives nothing to the fans. In a way, I guess it kind of gives a lot of things to haters of the first movie, but I don't even think they like this movie either. Again, I don't think I've ever seen anyone say, I hated the first movie, but I love this movie because it completely destroys everything that was established in the first movie. You have a movie that relies on nothing but fan service versus a movie that does everything in its power to just give the fans the opposite of what they want. A giant you, a giant middle finger to the fans. I'm not saying any of this stuff to be like, oh, Deadpool is the better movie, Joker is the better movie. I'll admit, okay, Deadpool is a little bit better, but they're both very different movies, so it's ridiculous to compare the two. Even if both movies were good, I would not compare them at all because they're just wildly different, besides the notion that they're both comic book movies. But more so, it's just interesting to me how different these two movies are when it comes to how they handle fan service. Both movies to me represent the extreme opposites. A movie that relies on nothing but fan service and a movie that's just completely devoid of fan service. Ideally, what you want is a mixture of both. You want to give the fans what they want, but you also want to take risks. You want to take your own creative risks with your creation. And as I mentioned before, Joker 2 is fully capable of doing such a thing. The idea that Arthur Fleck regrets being the Joker, there was no Joker, it was Arthur Fleck that did all the crimes in the first movie, it's possible to have that in this movie, and then also give the fans what they wanted to see, a story of the Joker and Harley Quinn committing crimes. Joaquin Phoenix's version of the Joker engaging with this universe's version of Harley Quinn. And also, don't make it a musical. This movie could have further explored the impact that the Joker had on Gotham in the first movie, but it doesn't. The movie just doesn't really acknowledge it all that much. You don't see anyone say that like, oh, the Joker was a good man, Arthur Fleck is innocent, whatever. Nothing like that at all. The rioters and protesters from the ending of the first movie that looked up to the Joker, they're just not in this movie at all. You could have that in the movie and then also have Arthur realize the mistake that he has started with the Joker. Have Arthur realize the impact he has had on Gotham City. Instead, the movie just treats it like it was a minor, insignificant thing. The Joker's rant in the Murray Franklin scene, it meant nothing to Gotham. The more I think about this movie and the more I think about the first movie, I end up hating this movie even more. You would think in this movie the Joker's impact on Gotham City would be felt, but it's not at all. And I'm sure fans of the first movie would have loved to see that be further explored in this movie. You could have that and also have Arthur be like, I regret starring the Joker, I regret all of it, there is no Joker, there's only Arthur Fleck. You could have both of those things, and, you know, maybe that would make the backlash to this stuff a little less harsh. Maybe people would be okay with the movie being a musical in that aspect, or at least they'd tolerate it a little bit more. You don't want to make a movie that's just 100% fan service and that's it, but you also don't want to make a movie that just says, you to the fans. A movie that will piss off fans and haters of the first movie. I have watched a lot of bad movies this year. That's not really much of a secret. If you looked at most of the videos I've put out this year, I've made that very clear. I've watched a lot of garbage this year. But this movie makes me think so much about, like, why is it bad? The relationship it has with the amazing first movie. And the fact that it's so, like, hell-bent on just undoing everything from the first movie. Just not acknowledging anything from the first movie. Treating a lot of the extremely important stuff from the first movie as if it was minor and insignificant. It makes me think, what the hell happened? This movie looked fantastic from the trailers. And then you watch the final movie and you're just like, what the hell is this? I've seen a few contrarians defend this by saying that, like, oh, that makes it subversive and different, but, like, that doesn't make it good. Again, the ideal thing to do is make a movie that both gives the fans what they want and also has creative risks in it from the creator. You don't want a movie that's only fan service and that's it, or only creative risks. You want both to be in your movie. I could very easily see this becoming a special kind of bad sequel. One that further damages the reputation of the first movie, which only the of sequels are capable of doing. With a lot of great movies that got bad sequels, you could still acknowledge that the early movies were good, you know? Yeah, the sequels to Jaws and The Matrix are both bad, but that doesn't mean the first movies are bad. They still have great first installments despite that. Believe it or not, no matter how bad the sequel trilogy may be, the original trilogy of Star Wars is still fantastic. They're still masterpieces, and nothing, I repeat, nothing from Disney-era Star Wars will ever change that. The constant onslaught of Star Wars slop might remove some of the magic that the original trilogy had at some point, but, you know, there's still going to be great movies. There's still going to be amazing movies. This is a special kind of bad sequel where I could see it completely ruining the reputation of the first movie. Well, maybe not completely ruining it, but I could see it affecting it in some way. Like, someone's perception of the first movie could change because of how bad this sequel is. And honestly, that's the worst thing a bad sequel could do. Ruin the previous installment. And that's exactly what Joker 2 did. This is again not the worst movie of the year. It doesn't come close. I know that's extremely hard to believe, but it's true. But out of every bad movie I've seen this year, I think about this one the most just because of how frustrating it is when compared to its predecessor. I just think about the potential it had to be amazing and how it just never lived up to that potential at all. Some of the bad movies I've watched this year are very self-explanatory as to why they're bad. Let's be honest, did anyone ever expect a feature-length Pop-Tarts commercial from Jerry Seinfeld and Amy Schumer to be good? No, no one thought that was going to be good. Everyone knew it would be trash, and indeed, the final product was trash. No surprises there. Again, though, this is a movie that people wanted to be good. This is a movie that I wanted to be good. But instead, what you're left with is not the worst movie of 2024, but easily the most frustrating movie of 2024. There is no Joker sequel. They never made a sequel to Joker. It was a one-off, standalone movie, and that was it. Joker is proof that not every movie needs a sequel. I love the ambiguous ending the first movie had that made us think, oh, what could happen with this version of the character going forward? And it's up to our imagination as to what Arthur Fleck will do from here on out. Because we never got, and we will never get, an official follow-up going forward. We will never have an official definitive answer as to what happened to Arthur Fleck. We will never know if this version of the Joker has his own version of Harley Quinn. All of that is up to our imagination, and it's better that way. There is no Joker sequel. End of story. Anyways, that's about it. If you enjoyed this video, then be sure to like, and if you're new to the channel, maybe consider subscribing, as it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you everyone for watching this video, and I will see you all next time. Adios.